So it's my pleasure to introduce Daniela Melo from Boston University. Daniela has published extensively in several academic journals and is the co-editor with Paul Manuel of the recently published book After the Carnation Revolution, Social Movements in Portugal since 25th April 1974, of which we will hear more later on.
It's a different book.
It's a different book.
Yeah.
I was listening to the presentation this morning. I thought it was the same book. So, okay, but this one is 2025, right? Just published.
So is the other one.
Okay. Well, see, I told you she published extensively. So Daniela was also a Fulbright Fellow in Portugal, has served as a consultant to the U.S. State Department on Portuguese and Spanish politics, and is also a frequent contributor to Portuguese media, where she comments on U.S. politics and foreign policy. And the title of her presentation, which you are already looking at, is No, This Is Not My Revolution, Natália Correia's Anarchist Praxis. Okay.
Thank you. How much time?
20 minutes? No, 15? Okay.
15 minutes?
To be able to eventually be extended to 20
Excellent.
minutes.
If needed, if need be.
I would appreciate.
Microphone. First of all, thank you all for having me here. It's always a pleasure to join this group of people, especially to talk about such an Azorean personality as Natália Correia. Now, you may be wondering, why is a political scientist in this panel talking about Natália Correia? I'm going to tell you. A few months ago, as you know, last year was the centenary of Natália Correia, and there was a lot of activities around that. And I was challenged by this group at Oxford of literature scholars to present a political view of Natália Correia. And I have to admit that, you know, I am not a deep connoisseur of Natália Correia's work. I am in the social sciences. I love literature, but you know, my knowledge of her literary production is rather superficial. But I was aware of her political engagement and her political activism. And in fact, hold on, just changing to the next slide. And I was intrigued by it, so I said, yes, sure. I was also working on various topics related to the Portuguese Revolution and the 50 years of the revolution. And I decided that I wanted to understand, I was going to try to understand what her political take on the revolutionary process had been. And so I picked up this book at an alfarrabista somewhere in Lisbon, right? Which was, it's not a literary work. It's not a fiction work, I should say. It's her diary and her reflections during the revolutionary process. She basically starts writing it the night of the revolution, the night that it starts, and she completes it by late 1975 and publishes it in 1978. It's called Não Percas a Rosa, right? Rather difficult to find, as it turns out. Upon looking at her work, I realized that, you know, she's not exactly an easy person to pin down, even politically. But I will make an attempt today to really give you what seemed to me almost obvious by the end of my reading of her. I suppose I'm curious to know whether you'll find it as clear or as coherent as I did. But let me say this let me start here. So Natália has really often been depicted as this political chameleon, right? So a woman of causes, a woman of personalities, but not a woman of political parties or of dogmas necessarily, right? She's often depicted, certainly in the media, as someone who depending on whether or not the person writing about Natália thinks this is a positive or a negative, as someone who would, be a turncoat politically, jump too easily from one party to the other, or bring ideas from different parties, right, into her own political positions. This is often, when not labeled as incoherence, right, it tends to be, sometimes labeled as just political eclecticism, a natural flip-flopping of a nonconformist poet, if you want, right? For example, let me give you some examples. She espouses feminist positions, right? Like access to abortion, but she rejected the feminist movements, or many of the feminist movements during the revolution had pretty harsh words for these types of organizations. She was a parliamentarian for the center-right, but she refused party discipline, eventually being voted out of the party, right? So this is political. There is a political eclecticism that, again, has often been attributed into this, a poet veering into politics, not being able to conform with the structure. But contrary to these common readings of Natália, certainly based primarily, again, on the thought that she expresses here, I'm going to argue that, in fact, there is a strong undercurrent and strong political coherence to her political praxis. And that coherence can be found in anarchism, okay? So, when we talk about her activism and engagement, just for a second, I'm not going to go line by line here, but whether you're talking about the dictatorship, the revolution, or the democratic period, you can often find her in the opposition to whatever the dogma of the moment is, and always critiquing, always questioning, always pushing back, right? We'll come back to that point later in the presentation. So, in analyzing Correia's diary in the Portuguese Revolution, I tried to demonstrate that the author and activist engaged in anarchic praxis, right? So the choice of the word, I'm sorry, I'm still getting used to this computer here. There we go. The choice of the word anarchic over anarchist is purposeful. To be very clear, Correia did not espouse the political ideology of anarchism. She did not wrap itself in the anarchist flag, if there is one. But she always tried to maintain a critical mind towards every dogma, right? And thus, I'm talking about her praxis, her political activism, her political engagement being anarchist, right? Without her being an anarchist. So what I'm arguing here is that her political and activist persona practiced an individualist form of anarchism, prizing the freedom of the individual above all else. In fact, I think this is one of the central pillars of her political thought. In her diary during the revolution, Correia reveals his in-depth knowledge of key anarchist thinkers. I mean, she has a deep knowledge of Marx and all Marxist writings. She has a deep knowledge of Proudhon, the anarchists, Bakunin. She uses the anarchist lens in order to understand what's happening in the Portuguese Revolution as she's doing that analysis. This is a quote that I pulled straight from her diary as well. She says, "Anarchists were my first guides of Marx's writings. Even if my tedium over ideals that wipe the tears of God's orphans with all of the world's certainties denied anarchism a faithful and attentive disciple, I was very enriched by the premises of their negativistic critiques." And in fact, she goes on to use Bakunin in particular over and over and over again to understand especially and to unpack what she considers to be the incoherence and incongruence of the communists during the revolution. So let me talk a little bit about anarchism here. So anarchism is a school of thought that is very broad and that had many many currents or many undercurrents. Here, I am placing her specifically within individualist anarchism, an anarchism that prioritizes individual freedom above all else over other currents of anarchism that prioritize fraternity, right? Group, society, religion, ideology, mutual aid. And here I also argue that there's another school of thought within anarchism that is often referred to as philosophical anarchism, that was very attractive to intellectuals in particular. And philosophical anarchism, I mean, I could spend a lot of time here unpacking this, but philosophical anarchists argue that there's the necessity for a constant intellectual critique of authority. So anarchism in general, right, pushes back against all forms of authority. When we think about the anarchist movement, we tend to think of the more revolutionary forms of the anarchist movement, in which anarchists are arguing for the overthrow of the state, the overthrow of religion, the overthrow of police, of militaries, right, of all forms of authority, and the creation of bottom-up societies based on mutual aid, small communities, etc. That's not where I see Natália Correia. Where I see Natália Correia is in this intellectual current of anarchism, this philosophical anarchism, that is centered on changing your society, not through revolutionary action, but through progressive critique and pushing back of authority wherever authority lies. So, and here, again, throughout the many essays that she writes during this period, she's constantly engaging, particularly with Bakunin. But I also heard echoes of Emma Goldman, if you're familiar with Emma Goldman's version of feminist anarchism, of individualism. There's so many echoes of that in Natália Correia's own expression of her understanding of what's happening in the revolution. So just to finish up the section on philosophical anarchism by giving you a quote in which I think she expresses quite well where she fits here. But unlike other anarchists that reject all forms of political regimes, that reject the state, that reject participating in the state as being a legitimate form of activism and political change, she doesn't do that. Here's where I go back to, she is evolutionary, not revolutionary, in terms of her own activism. So this is a quote. All of her quotes are long, very long sentences and very hard to translate, if I may say so. But this is the best I could get. I hope that the meaning translates. She says, by granting individuals and opposition groups that disbelieve in the social order that enshrines natural goodness and legal capacity to deny its benefits, democracies breed the adversaries who destroy them. Again, this is, think about what she's saying here. I think it's also, something that applies very much right now, that democracies actually allow for ideologies that are against democracy itself within them. And then she says, it is, however, within the scope of this democratic ingenuity that the spirit is free to act differently from what is expected of it, achieving the creative works that give continuity to genius. So again, here you can really see that philosophical anarchism that is present, that it's not necessarily against the regime. And in fact, she is making the argument that democracy of all of those systems is the one that allows for the most individual freedom, for creativity, right? The continuity of the genius, what she sometimes refers to as the spirit, right? For the spirit to be free. She also, throughout her entire political career, and I'm sure we all know a good number of examples of this, displays an affinity with key anarchist principles. I summarize them very quickly here, but one of the central ideas of all anarchist thought is that one needs to be true to one's own ideals, and anarchists tend to refer to that as prefigurative politics. You need to live by what you preach, right? You need to actually espouse your ideals, live your ideals, practice them without fear, with great courage, no hypocrisy. Anarchists also believe in the duty of direct action, right? That wherever oppressive authority is present, open defiance and resistance is necessary. And that's how you bring about change. So the change has to be brought about by each individual in anarchism, right? They all, certain currents of anarchism may argue that you have to do it together in groups. You need to create, there's Marxist versions of anarchism as well that that put more importance in collective action. But at the heart of it, and most anarchist philosophers are saying it's about the individual, right? The individual is the one that has to liberate themselves first, that has to push back and has this duty. And then there's the idea of propaganda by deed, right? This idea from anarchist activists of the 19th century is that public acts of defiance of authority will embolden others to act, and thus they are very important, if not the most important, for the activists to participate in. Now, if you look at, let me go back to this slide earlier here. If you look, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, but if you look at this slide and you see that, during the dictatorship, here she is as a journalist, as a writer, often a target of PED, right? Often the target of censorship. She's often siding with the opposition, Norton Matos, Humberto Delgado, with MUD, with the Comissão Eleitoral de Unidade Democrática, like whenever the opportunity and the space is there, she either takes it or she creates it, right? And she often creates that space of opposition as well. During the revolution, I gave only a few examples there, but that list could go on. She presents a very vocal opposition to the Portuguese Communist Party, to other Marxist-inspired ideologies. She's mostly focused on left-wing ideologies because that's what she sees as the dominant forces of the revolution. So those are her targets. She's critical of what she calls a canonized armed forces movement, right? That can do no wrong, and this paternalistic vision of the MFA. And during the democratic period, she accepts being Secretary of State of Culture under the Mário Soares government, but then she, as I mentioned previously, becomes a member of parliament for the PPD-PSD and eventually an independent member of government. Now, when she looks at the revolution, again, think about those anarchist principles I was just talking about, think about those anarchist tenets, right? When she talks about the revolution, you can see her thought evolves very quickly. I brought 3 quick passages just from the first year of the revolution. On the day of the revolution, she writes, "The imminence of seeing blossoming everywhere the spring that I have always carried inside of my love for freedom bites my heart like an unbearable joy." By July 3rd. "Personally, I consider the inebriating carnation liquor to be spilled. The hangover contains characters that leap from farce to nightmare. The farce of swallowing up a revolution that closed its eyes to a moribund totalitarianism to fatten another." She's very quickly, putting her critical goggles on and saying, hey, hold on, are we basically taking one ideology and just supplanting it with another form of ideology, one totalitarian way of thinking, and replacing it with another? And she's doing this pretty early on in the revolutionary process. By September, when things are heating up with Spínola, right, between Spínola and the Armed Forces Movement, she says, and here comes the title of my presentation, "No, this is not my revolution. My revolution flares up where intelligence recognizes that capitalism and socialism flow from a single poisonous source that divides its watercourses to deceive with different flavors those who drink its poison." Never boring. I want to spend a couple of minutes on her criticisms of the PCP in particular, because as I told you earlier, this is where it's the most evident that she's using the anarchist and she's using Bakunin in particular. She opens up this section by saying, I was particularly impressed by Bakunin's accurate aim at the Bismarckian concept of the Marxist conception of proletarian power. This woman should have been a political scientist, okay? What, scolds the Bakunian laugh? What, the state preparing its own abolition? And I brought this passage that I translated because I think it captures a lot of her critique, but again, and how that critique is an anarchist critique at its heart. So this is another passage from her. She says, the myth of the state's self-extinction, which will be consummated once the communist state is reached, nourishes its perennial provisional nature, which, mythologized, only strengthens the concept of the effective collaboration of the people. Reality shows, however, that this effective fusion of the people in the proletarian state is a pure abstraction under which class hatred remains intact. No, opiate instigators of the wolf class of social class, the seeds you sow for the utopian harvest of class extermination only seek to bear fruit that satisfies your insatiable totalitarian gluttony. With a semantic punch, you pound the bell of class consciousness into the heads of the working masses. Horrendous pedagogues, you pretend to ignore that before social condition, there is the nature of the individual, a singular reality, not interchangeable with any of the same class, which is why even the most exploitative workers can harbor a conservative character. Conversely, it is common for the greatest holders of a revolutionary consciousness to come from the bourgeois class. An important part of theory of revolution, by the way, right? So, I mean, in this passage alone, I mean, she's questioning the authoritarianism within the Marxist theory of revolution. There's another passage that didn't quite make it here in which she talks about the farce of the dictatorship of the proletariat and how the dictatorship of the proletariat is just another mechanism, a tool of totalitarian thought and of authority being imposed upon the masses. The myth, she attacks the myth of the state that will dissolve itself, having an all-powerful state that having all that power will just willingly give it away as being untenable. And she even goes into the false assumption about class consciousness and class identity, right? All in these 2 paragraphs filled with color. So my main argument here, once again, is that she uses this anarchist lens to make sense of the discourses and tactics of the Portuguese Communist Party, which she viewed as a dogmatic party bent on replacing one form of oppression with another. It's not the PCP only that is her target. Everyone is her target. Spinola, Othello, I mean, even the centrists, even Melo and Tunes, who she was a friend of, you know, she manages to basically be a, what's the expression I want here? An equal opportunity offender, if you want. An equal opportunity, you know, critical intellectual, right, of the world that she's seeing. So she applies similar principles, I argue, to most of her political positions. At its heart, Correia's driving impetus across regimes, be it the Estado Novo, the revolution, or the democratic period, in my opinion, can be distilled into this one central question, right? And that central question is the policy or the party or the individual or the social movement or whatever else you want to put there, like, is this one, like, is this party, is this individual, is this organization one that fosters the liberation or the oppression of the individual, right? If the first, I dare say that she would lean towards supporting it. If the latter, she would vehemently and vocally oppose it. I will end with this particular quote that from an interview that she gave in 1980, in which, once again, she doesn't use this terminology, but she very much embraces that idea so present in philosophical anarchism. She says, I've always had a political preference, and that political preference rests essentially and systematically on the defense of human rights and freedom of expression. Whether my politics are more to the left or to the right, well, my dear friend, if the establishment is right-wing, I'll be more to the left. If it's left-wing, I'll have to be a little bit more to the right. I believe it is the task of intellectuals to correct the establishment. Otherwise, they're not doing anything, right? So what I see here is not incoherence. What I see here is a very strong undercurrent of individual anarchism. But I am looking forward to your opinions and your takes on this, and to, that you can help me fill the gaps in my own knowledge about Natália and her own takes on her politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela, for this very thought-provoking stance on reading of Natália Correia's stance. I'm sure we could also find some correspondence with her literary work, but I'm not an expert either, so I won't ask you about it. Donc, je passe au français. J'ai le plaisir de vous présenter Leonor Martins Coelho, professeure à l'Université de Madeira, où elle dirige le doctorat international en littérature et cultures insulaires. Elle est chercheuse intégrée du Centre d'études comparatistes de l'Université de Lisbonne au sein du groupe Locus et participe régulièrement à des colloques internationaux tout en organisant séminaires et journées d'études. Ses recherches se situent à l'intersection des études culturelles et des études littéraires. Le titre de sa communication est « Les Açores et l'Atlantique dans Viagem, Juno » de Pedro Almeida Maia, un nouveau monde océanique et une différente géopolitique planétaire. Je te donne 15 minutes, donc on ne savait pas, on a le premier.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais lire ma communication pour essayer de ne pas dépasser le temps. En fait, j'ai une communication pour 20 minutes. On va voir comment je vais résoudre la question. Pedro Almeida Maia, figure majeure de la nouvelle littérature contemporaine açorienne atlantique, inscrit l'espace atlantique au cœur de son œuvre. Auteur de 8 romans salués par la critique, il est reconnu par des voix telles que Onésimo Teotónio de Almeida ou Miguel Real pour sa capacité créative à mettre en lumière les Açores, la mer et les échanges intercontinentaux, entre autres. Dans ses romans Bom Tempo no Canal, A Conspiração da Energia et Capítulo 41, A Descoberta da Atlântida, il explore les enjeux écologiques et géopolitiques liés à l'archipel dans un style mêlant roman policier et langage cinématographique. Dans sa production littéraire embrasse aussi bien les migrations vers les Açores que celles en direction du continent américain. Dans la nouvelle Novas Gerações, une Canadienne par enquête de sens sur les 9 îles, tandis que les romans Escrava Açoriana et Condamnation, on revisite les parcours d'Açoriens au Brésil et aux États-Unis. Ces récits illustrent la confrontation entre les espoirs et des illusions dans les trajectoires atlantiques, avec en toile de fond des événements historiques marquants, tels que l'esclavage blanc au XIXe siècle pour le premier récit, ou la prohibition de l'alcool, lei seca, et l'affaire Zacco-Vanzetti au XXe siècle pour le second. Dans Il Amérique, Almeida Maia revient sur la période d'après-guerre et la transformation géopolitique de l'île de Santa Maria, devenue plateforme stratégique américaine. Le roman, inspiré par un fait réel, raconte le voyage clandestin et périlleux de Manet, symbole de l'esprit de survie et de fuite. L'auteur tisse ainsi une œuvre ancrée dans l'histoire, le territoire et la diaspora, articulant constamment le local et le global, un axe central dans A Viagem de Juno, bien que de façon différente, comme nous allons le voir maintenant. Publié, je crois que j'ai stoppé, voilà. Publié en 2019, A Viagem de Juno, qui prend comme point de départ les Açores et les changements climatiques mondiaux, s'inscrit dans le genre de la fiction spéculative. Il dialogue avec la science-fiction, la cli-fi, la fiction d'aventure, le suspense. En 2022, l'auteur déclare, et je le traduis, « Dans ce voyage, je décris un futur possible en 2049 où nous continuerons à ignorer les changements climatiques et à vouloir changer seulement au bord du précipice. » La citation continue. Vous avez ici le deuxième paragraphe traduit de la quatrième de couverture. Dans le prologue de ce récit, le lecteur apprend que l'intrigue porte sur la reconstruction de la société après la catastrophe ayant frappé la Terre. L'histoire explore en effet les multiples conséquences environnementales des années chaudes, révélant à l'ère de la 5e extension les nouvelles formes de vie et une compréhension différente de la géopolitique mondiale. La catastrophe annoncée se manifeste clairement dès 1980, lorsqu'une société secrète de sauvegarde écologique tente de récupérer le catalyseur de climat de la oil drill, supposément situé au Brésil, mais la fin du récit le situe ensuite sur l'île de San Miguel, près du volcan Fogo. L'histoire débute réellement en 2049, lorsque, accompagné de la médecin Pamela Fincher, Aaron Wilmarson se réveille à Moscou après un long processus de cryopréservation. Le prologue précise que l'action commence en décembre de cette année-là, dans les installations de Kryomovska, un centre reconnu pour ses avances médicales, des compétences tout aussi maîtrisées par la Russie que par les États-Unis, ainsi que par 6 autres pays, dont la Chine. L'intrigue se poursuivra essentiellement en 2050 avec une attention particulière portée aux Açores et à divers autres lieux dans le monde, tels que le Brésil, Angola, Philippines, etc. Tout au long du récit, le jeune Juno Kobler et ses parents accompagnent et sont liés aux mésaventures de son grand-père, Lucas Pontes, également appelé Barbas, qui devra affronter Ignor Wickner, qui est le vice-président de Translife, et résoudre plusieurs désaccords avec les membres fondateurs de la société, à savoir Olivier Nair, Zaki, Feng, Bruno Crudelli, Michael Caden, que l'on découvre plus tard être le président de Translife, et Azina Tahera, la seule femme de la congrégation masculine. Notons dès maintenant la question de l'industrie géothermique abordée dans Bon Tempo no Canal est reprise dans Viagem de Juno, où l'on apprend qu'elle a commencé à produire plus d'électricité que ce qui était consommé, permettant à Translife de commencer ses activités utilisant le réseau tubulaire pour distribuer l'énergie. Le titre du roman semble se limiter au voyage du jeune Juno, né à Ponta Delgada dans cette ère du technocène. Cependant, en réalité, il fait référence à bien d'autres déplacements à travers le monde, rendus possibles par un système inventé aux Açores et ensuite mondialisé. Et voici une citation qui me paraît très intéressante, traduite également en français, et vous avez l'original en portugais. L'Azores était un autre tremblement de terre que le changement de la nouvelle ère avait apporté. Un moyen de transport révolutionnaire qui avait fait ses premiers pas dans l'Atlantique Nord, dans un archipel de 9 villes particulièrement d'une beauté stupéfiante, les Açores. En tout cas, les multiples voyages et les dangers qu'ils comportent, les mystères à résoudre associés à la problématique écologique, l'un des thèmes les plus actuels de notre époque, comme le rappelle par exemple Guattari ou Noah Harari, font de Viagem de Juno un récit essentiel dans les domaines des humanités environnementales, tout en répondant à Marie Redon lorsqu'elle affirme, et je la cite, « Quant à la littérature, c'est aussi sur les îles que peuvent s'expérimenter les solutions pour échapper au syndrome mortifère des changements climatiques. » Fin de citation. Ainsi, ce roman explore la question environnementale et les avancées technologiques futures qui permettent des voyages planétaires rapides, une vie facilitée par les progrès scientifiques de toutes sortes et la résolution des situations extrêmes, le tout grâce à la contribution des Açores et des Açoriens. D'ailleurs, la dimension insulaire est instaurée dès le premier chapitre, avec également cette longue citation. pas si long finalement. La position des Açores finit par dominer l'Atlantique et les îles se transforment en point d'arrêt principal entre l'Amérique du Nord et l'Eurasie, particulièrement valorisée après l'installation des Chinois à la base des lages. Une constatation qui sera récupérée plus tard lorsque Ignore Dieter déclare « Le contrôle de l'océan Atlantique est essentiel. Géostratégiquement positionné, l'archipel est une véritable richesse. Même les Chinois en sont conscients. » Dans cette touche d'humour et de critique qui traverse le texte de Pedro de Maia, comme c'est souvent le cas dans la création générale de cet auteur, d'autres aspects sont mis en évidence. Avec les changements climatiques, l'aviation devient presque impraticable. Pour les trajets qui parviennent encore à fonctionner, les taxes d'annulation ou de retard sont exorbitantes. Les réclamations constantes et l'industrie de l'aviation subit de lourdes conséquences. Dans cette atmosphère, l'auteur déclare « Il n'y avait qu'un seul moyen de transport intercontinental qui était synonyme de sécurité, rapidité et ponctualité, la ouate. » Dès le début de l'intrigue, le lecteur découvrira l'emprise des Açores, maintenant oui, avec une longue citation qui est là, lorsque le texte nous informe. Internationalement connu sous le nom de Azores Underwater Tube et intégré dans le réseau tubulaire sous-marin mondial, ce projet a été conçu par un adolescent surdoué, diplômé avec distinction en physique architecturale aux Açores. L'investissement a d'abord concerné un réseau intra-archipélagique, puis Translife a acquis l'idée et l'a étendu à échelle mondiale. L'archipel portugais a ainsi accueilli l'une des stations des passagers les plus fréquentées de la planète. Bien que l'inventeur originaire des îles de Brume soit resté anonyme, le réseau ferroviaire est devenu populaire sous le nom de Azarway. Le récit de Almeida Maia met en valeur la force açorienne, comme nous le verrons à plusieurs reprises, notamment lorsque Lucas Pontes explique à Juno que la marine de Porto Formoso a joué un rôle fondamental dans cette nouvelle dynamique. Également avec cette citation. La marina a commencé à être construite en 2032. C'était l'affirmation du courage d'un peuple entier face aux calamités. Des personnes qui croient. Après la montée des eaux, les Açoriens ont perdu des biens importants car ils vivaient près de la mer. Nous avons migré vers l'intérieur des îles au cours des 5 années difficiles. La marina nous a redonné espoir. Le projet a créé des emplois et a éloigné les jeunes de la délinquance. Lorsque la station d'Azarway a été inaugurée, nous sommes redevenus une partie du monde. Le roman est aussi consacré à la résilience des Açoriens. Dès le début de la catastrophe liée à la montée des eaux, la population des flores renforce le port des lages et adapte le littoral de Santa Cruz. Les habitants de Corvo participent à la construction de l'Azarway et à la circulation des biens et des personnes. Le Fayal, bien qu'ayant perdu du terrain, renforce son identité maritime avec une marina, un mégaport ajusté au mouvement maritime de l'Atlantique Nord, leadership mondial en océanographie. Bien que la culture viticole de Pico ait souffert, elle a été déplacée vers l'intérieur de l'île, qui a su continuer à développer également le tourisme portuaire. Graciosa n'a pas trop souffert. Les Fins-Jean de Saint-Georges ont disparu, mais le Fin-Jean de Coupe devient, dans une symbolique qui n'est pas fortuite, l'une des 7 merveilles subaquatiques. Les changements à Torside n'ont pas été appréciés par les habitants, tandis que San Miguel a dû faire face à la perte de plusieurs zones, Mosteiro, Quente, etc. D'autres régions se recomposent et des nouvelles excursions touristiques émergent. Puisqu'on est à Santa Maria, voici ce que le texte nous dit pour Santa Maria. Je crois que j'ai perdu également mon PowerPoint.
Peut-être appuyer sur l'autre.
Voilà. Non? Non. Voilà. Mais dans l'écran, je ne l'ai pas. Ça ne fonctionne pas. São metade da página. Não temos no ecrã.
Perdeu a ligação, deve ter carregado num botão
Qualquer.
Será que é este aqui em cima? Vou carregar nos botões todos até.
só.
Não foi boa ideia.
Santa Maria fez-me esperar um bocadinho.
Você queria-
Estamos em Santa Maria, portanto precisamos de fazer uma pausa. Voilà. Je crois que le club, voilà, et j'arrive à retrouver, voilà. Je crois que j'ai à nouveau appuyé sur quelque chose. Non. Pour Santa Maria, voici le texte. Le club naval s'est transformé en instance balnéaire et la pointe sud-est de l'île a vu des maisons disparaître. C'était peut-être l'île des Açores où la tristesse pesait le plus dans le regard des habitants. On disait que c'était dû à la fermeture de l'aéroport. Le récit souligne encore que l'Atlantique reste constamment exposé à la trajectoire des ouragans, ce qui met en évidence l'importance d'une éducation climatique adaptée et un pari sur la recherche liée à la mer, à la médecine, ainsi qu'à des spécialisations permettant de répondre aux effets des catastrophes naturelles et aux nouveaux enjeux qui en découlent. Mais l'archipel a su se moderniser. Villafranca do Campo, par exemple, s'est transformé en Villafranca do Mar, ouvrant la voie à un nouvel ordre planétaire. Et cette longue citation mérite qu'on s'y attarde. Outre l'un des terminaux les plus fréquentés au monde, la gare internationale de Villafranca do Mar était encore une majestueuse construction vitrée. Les passagers ne se rendaient que rarement compte du temps d'attente, tant l'offre de services et d'expériences était riche. Chambres individuelles d'yogamar, magasins duty-free, simuleurs de réalité virtuelle, sport électronique, concerts intimistes, librairies de déclamation, arts plastiques communautaires, casinos de coin, méditation collective, expositions vivantes, toutes visibles à travers les murs transparents séparant le bâtiment des eaux de l'océan. Cette gare se veut un non-lieu, comme le dirait Marc Auger, mais cet espace de connaissance, de partage et d'interconnexion humaine n'élimine pas le consumérisme propre de l'ère du capitalocène. La fiction d'Almeida Maia souligne que le Portugal, bien que récemment sorti de l'Union européenne, c'est la fiction qui le dit, cherche à s'imposer sur la scène géopolitique mondiale, notamment grâce à la position stratégique des Açores. Face à l'influence croissante de BRICS, avec les 4 pays essentiels, Brésil, Russie, Inde et Chine, le texte a été publié en 2019, n'oublions pas, ces pays ambitionnent de contrôler l'Atlantique Nord, sans s'allier aux États-Unis. Dans ce contexte fictionnel, le Portugal est présenté comme une économie émergente potentiellement proche des pays du groupe MINT, Mexique, Indonésie, Nigeria et Turquie. Le roman suggère que le Portugal, après les graves conséquences de la catastrophe environnementale, pourrait jouer un rôle central dans une nouvelle dynamique mondiale, avec les Açores en position stratégique. En effet, et Madeira aussi. En effet, après les décennies d'incertitude et de crise, le Portugal, en renouant avec ses recherches sur les connexions maritimes, trouvera les solutions à un nouvel élan car il dispose de recherches de fonds marins, a su stimuler les biosciences, possède des réserves de ressources naturelles, a su exploiter ses terres arables, a créé des opportunités d'emploi dans le secteur agroalimentaire, etc., faisant ainsi face aux dissonances engendrées par la catastrophe mondiale. C'était l'un des rares endroits au monde, non pour le Portugal, capable de fermer leurs frontières sans perdre d'avantages géopolitiques, car la mer était un allié, représentait la plus grande zone économique exclusive du continent européen, grâce aux archipels des Açores et de Madeira. Si les Açores occupent une place centrale dans la diégèse, d'autres lieux sont également évoqués à travers les voyages entrepris par Lucas Pontes et son petit-fils qui inaugurent un périple au bord du Maglev. Ce réseau ultra rapide permet de transporter les protagonistes vers l'Afrique via route euro-africaine ou l'Asie par la route euro-asienne ou n'importe où ailleurs en un temps record avec un confort que le passager actuel envierait. Si les voyages impliquent pour le jeune Juno la découverte de nombreux lieux, comme Luanda, Manille, etc., de ce côté, Lucas Pontes cherche à se racheter près de la société de l'incident du catalyseur à Manaus ou de la mort d'Aaron, bien qu'il ait demandé à Crionosca de préserver ce dernier. Mais ce qu'il cherche avant tout, c'est libérer sa fille Rebecca Ponte-Kobler, capturée par Igor Wittner, qui désire rencontrer le prodigieux auteur qui a su unir le monde entier sous l'eau, comme si l'image du cerveau scientifique ne pouvait être que masculine. Cependant, la fin du récit, en mettant en lumière le rôle féminin, révèle que ce prodigieux personnage n'est autre que Rebecca, une identité enfin révélée par des médias avides de scoop. Juno retourne entre-temps aux Açores, à bord, entre autres, de la voie euro-américaine Maglev. Ce voyage aux origines du jeune garçon permet de constater que l'Atlantique met en place la route touristique atlantico-insulaire reliant les Açores, Madère, les Canaries et les Baléares, formant ainsi un tracé des destinées ibériques dans une nouvelle géopolitique planétaire. Le roman de Pedro Almeida Maia met en lumière une modernité qui inaugure une société ultra-technologique où la robotique, la biométrie, les nanosciences ouvrent la voie à un nouveau monde holographique, hypermoderne, etc. Mais il ne s'agit pas d'un univers dystopique. En ce qui concerne les Açores, le roman dépeint un archipel harmonieux, d'une beauté stupéfiante, ravivant l'image de l'île comme un lieu utopique, mais libre, mais très prospère. Et voici une petite citation. Les Açores, 9 petites îles ici au milieu de l'Atlantique, elles se sont inspirées de l'exemple de Singapour et sont devenues le paradis. Il y a une critique également là-dessus. D'ailleurs, les médias annoncent de nouveaux gisements de gaz ont été découverts dans l'Atlantique Nord, ce qui renforce l'intérêt étranger pour les forages proches des Açores. L'ensemble du territoire est désormais exploité en exclusivité par des industries portugaises en partenariat avec la Chine, bien que la volonté de renouer des relations politiques de la part de l'Union du Nord persiste, et même les États-Unis envisagent de réactiver la base des lages. C'est toujours la fiction qui le dit. Le roman de Pedro Almeida Maia revisite l'imaginaire du voyage, de la découverte et de la domination portugaise dans le monde. Il place le Portugal et ses îles, plus particulièrement les Açores, au cœur de notre planète, abordant la nécessité d'inverser les catastrophes environnementales et de repenser les scénarios apocalyptiques. Ce récit porte un message éducatif, soulignant qu'il vaut la peine de se battre pour l'avenir de la Terre, même si, comme le souligne Jean-Hugues Barthélemy, la gravité de la situation dans laquelle se trouve notre planète n'est pas encore pleinement comprise. Malgré les cataclysmes écologiques, les Açores ont su retrouver leur place dans le monde. Le roman rappelle d'une certaine manière l'Atlantide, et reconstruit avec une intensité symbolique sans doute indéniable et mythique en même temps, et qui persiste justement dans cette cliffie. À ce sujet, Marie Redon affirme, et je termine avec ce passage, la mondialisation du discours scientifique occidental construit sous une nouvelle forme de vulnérabilité insulaire en faisant de l'île la figure de proue d'une catastrophe planétaire annoncée et invente ou réinvente le mythe d'une Atlantide prospective. Et pour conclure, en réalité, la viagem de Juno souligne la manière dont les Açores ont su planifier, investir dans l'éducation et la science, tirer parti des conditions naturelles et de leur emplacement stratégique. L'archipel a misé sur une économie durable et multifonctionnelle, diversifiée et ultramoderne, en intégrant des secteurs comme la pisciculture, mariculture, énergie renouvelable, etc. Ainsi, les Açores sont devenus un laboratoire privilégié et un centre d'irradiation civilisationnelle. La culture littéraire ainsi que la crise environnementale et climatique occupent une place centrale dans ce roman. Dans La viagem de Juno, les îles sont indéniablement évoluées et en un monde océanique postmoderne. Il semble également que ce récit puisse participer à l'élargissement des sous-genres associés à la fiction spéculative et à la cliffie, inaugurant peut-être une sorte de littérature Açores futuriste, ancrée dans un cadre épistémologique inédit. En somme, en liant écologie, fiction, futur, Almeida Maia a permis aux Açores de sortir de leur rôle périphérique pour les ancrer au cœur de la centralité atlantique et planétaire. Merci de votre attention.
Merci, Leonor. On voit bien que la littérature continue de faire le portrait et de proposer des versions alternatives à la réalité, même quand on écrit depuis l'île. So now it's really an honor and a privilege to introduce, to those of you who still don't know him, Professor Onésimo Teotónio de Almeida, Emeritus Professor at Brown University. He received his PhD in philosophy from Brown University and taught Portuguese culture and intellectual history there from 1975 to 2004, serving as a department chair for 12 years. He also taught at the Centre for Study of the Early Modern World and offered a university course on values and worldviews for the Wayland Collegium. An accomplished author and editor, as I'm sure you all know. His most recent book, O Século dos Prodígios, A Ciência no Portugal da Expansão, has won 4 prestigious prizes. He has been elected to both the Academia da Marinha and the Portuguese Academy of Sciences and has received honorary degrees from the University of Aveiro and University Lusófona in Lisbon, and so on and so on. And I would like to add a personal note, if I may, that if someone could be an Atlantic bridge, it would be Professor Onésimo, because for many decades he has been so generously bringing people together, sharing his resources. He's always available, even for people he doesn't know, like me. When I first contacted him, he was on vacation and in August, and he still gave me a list of books and authors. So I'm forever thankful, and I know he has inspired many younger generations of scholars, and I had to say this. So now, just Tomás de Freitas, an immigrant from Flores, 1873 to 1951, a published author in Idaho and Oregon.
Yeah, you praise me for doing this on vacation, and my wife chastises me for doing the same.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Thank you. I would like to start by telling a story of Natália Correia. By the way, her book, Descobri que era Europeia, which is her journal of a trip to America in 1950, was just published in English by Tagus Press, and I could direct the series, an Azorian series. And the book just came out. I wrote the preface for it. It's very interesting because you can see already, she was 27, and you can see already the libertarian. I prefer to call her a libertarian than an anarchist, but anyway. In 1983, this story I'm going to say is included in the excellent biography of Natália, written by Felipe Martins. I told her a few stories, and this one is there. 1983, she was in the US representing General Yanes, who was then the president, on the Day of Portugal celebrations in the US. And it just happened that she was at the Biltmore Hotel in Providence, and I went to pick her up. I was her driver. I had invited her in 1978 for an event, so I knew her. So I went to the hotel in the morning to pick her up, and it just happened that was the weekend of the graduation at Brown. One of the famous graduate then was John Kennedy Jr. So his family, his uncle, Ted Kennedy, always took the place of his father because his father died. And he was always coming to Brown to the events, like sports events, parents' weekend. So I arrived there at the lobby. Natália wasn't there yet. And Natália, so I saw Jackie Onassis. And Ted Kennedy, Patrick Kennedy, the whole family clan with John Kennedy Jr. And then all of a sudden, Natália comes down the stairs, just like a royal personality. And she's coming down. When she gets close to me, I tell her, Natália, do you know who's behind you? And she said, no. You know, at the time you could smoke. You know, she had the book here. She said, no. And I said, Jackie Onassis. And she said, e vai daí? So what? And she did not turn back. She did not look. That was Natália. Anyway, I had here some jokes about Trump, but I really took a lot of time. But I can't resist about many Chaves is here. My good friend from Centro is here. And you know that Hudson was mentioning. Hudson is a community in a town in Massachusetts where there's a very big community from Santa Maria. So people from Santa Maria, half of them are Chaves, half are Braga. So there was a teacher there called Alda Chaves. In English, Alda Chaves. So in the intercom in school, one day they announced, all the Chaves, please come to the office. 50 kids showed up. Anyway, so I am going to talk to you about Thomas Freitas, who was born in 1873, died in 1951. I wrote this for an event in Flores. And when Antonio Monteiro, when I asked him what should I talk about, I gave him a list of topics, and he said this one. But this one was written for Flores, even though it's not the exact same thing, because when I am 5 minutes before the end, just let me know and I'll skip. I'll get to the final pages. Donald Warren, who first spoke to me of the Flores-born Thomas L. Freitas. He told me of a native of that island who had immigrated as a young man to California and who thereafter resided in Oregon and Idaho. I recall Donald Warren telling me that Thomas Freitas had written a few plays and had sent them to a theater company in New York. Supposedly, he'd booked a meeting with someone from that company. Warren added that in Idaho, the Freitas was sometimes referred to as the first playwright and literary pioneer of that state. Donald Warren and Jeffrey Gomes included a chapter about Thomas Freitas in their now classic volume about the Portuguese in America, Land as Far as the Eye Can See, Portuguese in the Old West, subsequently published in Lisbon as a translation, in Portuguese translation, under a title of my suggestion, Portugueses no Far West, Terra a Perder de Vista. On multiple occasions, I asked Donald Warren, also the author of the most important book on Azores whaling in the US, So Ends This Day, to write an essay about the plays written by that Florentino to be published in Gavia Brown, a journal I founded in 1980 and still running. However, despite repeated and sincere promises to do so, he never did send me the solicited texts. Thus, the only information regarding Thomas de Freitas that we have in print today is what's included in that chapter, Land as Far as the Eye Can See. Meanwhile, I decided to search the internet when I was invited to go to Flores in April. I decided to search the internet for whatever I could find about Thomas de Freitas. And in quick succession, I discovered that the Library of Boise State University in Idaho had the bibliographic estate of Thomas de Freitas in the Special Collections and Archives Division. Enthused, I immediately wrote to the director, inquiring as to the possibility of obtaining a copy of files that were in our library. After an hour and 15 minutes, the director responded, she was not Portuguese, that she had made arrangements to send me those files and other material should I be interested in it. Consulting the footnotes in Land as Far as the Eye Can See, I'll skip this one. A copy of the author's autobiography must be present amongst, too many bibliographical and footnote details, I'll skip them. So among there are 27 folders of various documents, and most of it in English, some of them are in Portuguese. And there is an autobiography in Portuguese 3 pages of a short autobiography, and I'll read it in English. They were translated by my son. I asked him to do this. Things that are incredible but true, he writes. My grandfather, Francisco Sete Freitas, was a teacher in our town, Lomba das Flores, Azores. He was the one who educated me through my 12th year of age. Afterwards, I was taught by an aunt who had 4 years of college in Lisbon, also a teacher, though as she married upon returning to Flores, she never properly taught school. However, as she lived nearby, I studied with her for 4 years and learned enough to allow me entry into any university in Lisbon. Aside from that, I had 4 uncles who did business in Lisbon at that time, and my people arranged for one of them to house me during the 4 years I'd spent in college. I was to depart on the 13th of June, 1890, but since on the 3rd day of that same month, a ship passed through Flores, a sailing vessel, Canaria, that was taking boys secretly, I fled that very night and came to America. Here in the states of Nevada, Oregon, and California, during the winter, I'd work for room and board, and I'd attend American schools, and in the summer, I'd work in the pastures and in the harvests for my clothes and shoes. And that's the way it remained then and later until I completed 2 years of college. When I learned with my grandfather and aunt, it wasn't necessary to run to the dictionary to understand what they were saying to me, as well as we all used the same words that everyone spoke in Flores, only better pronounced and in their proper places. In America, the same happened, though adding to it the open secret that literature in all languages is meant to clearly say the most with the fewest words. This is not very nicely written because this is written in the Portuguese, remember. So I'm translating from the Portuguese, so it's not the best English, but it's interesting that it would be more interesting if I read it in Portuguese, but it seems we are not using the language here. However, the fact is that I'm already forgetting the little I learned, or the fog of old age leaves me unable to understand what I read. Then there are some poems, I'll skip that. On the 15th of June in 1890, I was to depart for Lisbon and enroll in a college there, residing in the home of an uncle of mine who was a businessman there. But instead, on the 2nd day of the same month, I got up and sought a boatman in a ship named Canaria that was mid-journey between the Azores and the United States of America. And it was thus that at 17 years of age, I arrived in this grand and liberal land. But I did not come illegally. Rather, I came with papers furnished by my father, who at that time provided citizenship to his wife and all of his children under 21 years of age. It was with those papers that I voted for many years. So the father had been an immigrant alone in the US. And so he was proud of the fact that he was not an illegal immigrant like it was customary. The ships would stop in the Azores and just recruit in the dark at night young men to work on board. Then he gives instructions to people in Flores, pay money back to this and this person. I'll skip all this. So there's a bunch of dossiers. The dossiers include a novel in English, an autobiography in English of about 300 pages. It includes lots of letters to the editors, short stories, some in Portuguese, lots of short stories in English. But I'm going to concentrate here to give you an example of how interventive he was. Letters that he wrote to the newspapers in Oregon and Idaho. He was quite he wrote frequently, and there are lots of them on all kinds of issues. And it's interesting. This is an immigrant. He went to the US when he was 17 years of age, and he became so involved. He's part of those the last frontier in America was a frontier coming from California into the interior, Idaho, and then lots of actually. All this is very nice, very well narrated in the book of Jeffrey Gomes and Donald Warren, Land as Far as the Eye Can See, how the immigrants, Azorian immigrants from California, moved inland. The book is extraordinary. I'll merely lift the veil on Thomas de Vrijter's civic participation in the newspapers of Oregon and above all of Idaho. In fact, our Florentino was an assiduous writer of letters to the editor, to the newspapers, the Oregonian and the Oregonian Daily Journal. The letters covered a diverse array of subjects. One of them reveals a biographical insight, but also provides clues regarding his ethical values. The title of the letter, Life, Ambition is Given Up. Subtitle, Plan to Teach Ignorant and Enrich Poor Finally Found Futile. To the editor, when I went to school, all teachers I ever knew always and without exception loved the most studious students the most, and because the latter learned the most, the former always delighted in teaching them the most. With cattle, horses, sheep, hogs, and trees, my father did just the opposite. He did, always and without exception, take better care of the weaker ones. Being one of the most neglected ones in all the schools attended, I felt very badly about it and promised myself that when I grew up, I would spend my entire life in teaching the ignorant and enriching the poor. I have progressed rather slowly, but have had an unshaken faith that someday I would succeed until I read your editorial in which you stated, until I read your editorial in which you stated that the government had taken over 60% of the Dakota farms for Texas on account of drought. I came to the decided conclusion then that my hopes were futile. The poor cannot be enriched because the ignorant utterly refuse to be taught, which means, in plainer words, that the laws which were printed in books and not written into the hearts of men are also futile. This one about the ideal of liberty is worth reading here today, while the First Amendment of the American Constitution, which grants the people with freedom of expression, is being put in question by the current president of a country, that for Thomas Vrijter was an El Dorado of liberty. Although a jingoistic panegyric that was common at the time, if the author of this letter were alive today, he'd certainly be scandalized by the trampling of the liberties he so exalted. The title of the letter given by the newspaper is Freedom's Strength. I'll skip the first part, and he says, no other nation on earth knows the true valuation of freedom better than we do, since we have had 3 great wars for its promotion and safety, nothing else. We neither sought nor took any plunders nor booties. On the contrary, we not only supplied our own booties, but also the boots many other men were made glad to wear. We have made, are making, and shall continue to make a good many blunders, but at the core, we know the true valuation of freedom. We also know the true worth of unity to defend priceless freedom the forefathers of this nation created and freely gave to the world. We have not kept any secret about it, but it seems to be a mysterious secret that in 160 years, we, as a united nation, have progressed farther in the matter of inventions and production than any other nation, and were the direct cause of all other nations to have advanced farther than the whole world had advanced since the beginning of history and long before existing records. The rest of the world just now seems to be afraid to give us credit for our hard and benevolent work. But I think our liberality gave us atomic energy. I'll add only one more example, a curious one at that, from his letters to the editor. This time, it's a position taken on evolutionary theory. The title given by the newspaper is Doctrine Held Not Tenable. Subtitle, Survival of Fittest, Not True in Nature or Religious Teachings. Here goes the letter. Portland, Oregon, August 1, to the editor. Mr. Pope writes a letter under the date of July 23rd, stating that whether we like it or not, the doctrine of evolution stands as well-established fact today. It is better proved now than was the theory that the earth was round until the day of Magellan. Yet, this is a quote from Mr. Pope. This is how he starts the letter. Yet, here is Thomas de Freitas talking. Yet, it cannot be denied that the laws of evolution are the laws of brutality, chance, indifference, and might, where the strongest becomes the fittest. It was under these same laws that Christ perished, was it not? Come. You whose thoughts are based upon reason cannot deny this crude fact. You cannot say that his teachings were not directly opposing those laws, which have no pity for the unfortunate weak. Behold the trees in a grove whose seeds fell by chance upon the earth's surface. It's easy to ascertain why some have grown stately and others dwarfly in size. Is it because the latter are less fit than the former? No, it's merely because the former fell on fertile spots in the ground, while the latter lodged on gravel, a leaf, a stone, or drier portions of the earth. Under the wanton laws of evolution, the overshadowed trees must perish, while within an arm's length there may be an open space on which they may have grown stately as their more fortunate brothers. Yes, Mr. Pope is right. God made the monkey and evolution the man. It's interesting because he's not opposing Darwin. He's saying that the ethical laws that people are deriving from the evolution do not have to be accepted by us. I mean, I taught a course for 4 decades about this, how that we're not bound by nature, we change nature. And the history of medicine is nothing but an attempt of countering nature. We counter that. There's nothing wrong with it. It is perfectly okay to do this. So you don't have to accept the brutal laws of, like sociobiologists who are doing this, we're advocating that. So this is why this letter is particularly interesting. Fine, I'm almost done, yeah. In the Poets' Corner, a magazine from the same newspaper, a literary page from the same newspaper, Thomas de Freitas also published various poems, though at the moment I do not have enough time to present them to you. I cannot resist, however, citing one written in flourish. First, the context of the poem. In January, I should have said that I skipped one part. As he wrote 3 plays, and he sent these 3 plays to a woman, a director of a theater company in New York. And she invited him. She wanted to meet him. So he went and met him. He was a tough guy. He must have been a difficult person because he waited. The secretary said, wait, she's not here. And he waited for hours. He was so fed up that he returned and he didn't want to talk. He never talked to the woman again. So the 3 plays still exist somewhere in the library. I've not been able to get them. And Donald Waring seems to have known, but I have not heard from Donald Waring. I don't think he's well. They may be lost forever. I don't know. Okay, so in January of 1905, 17 years after immigrating, the author visited the Azores. Thomas Freitas came to the Azores. Having arrived in São Miguel, he missed his ferry to Flores, his ship to Flores, and so only made it to the island of his birth in March. He then married Elisa Lopes, a young woman aged 17. His father must have noted that he did not appear to have been financially successful in America, and apparently recommended that he remained on the island. Thomas' response was cutting. I quote, "Were you to give me the whole island, I'd never remain here married, simply because I do not want my children to have to leave their homeland as I did, leaving you and her. Hope died here, Father, and life absent of hope is intolerable." It was in this state of mind that he wrote the following poem. His last writing before leaving to France. It's Returning to America, and the poem goes like this. "Oh, bring me back to the USA, back to where freedom reigns, where the youth is careless, happy, gay, where genius is not tied in chains. Oh, take me back to Western Hills, those rugged hills where tall firs grow, where summer song the woodland fills, where fragrant breezes softly blow. Oh, take me back to Oregon, back to the land of shady streams, back to the land where sets the sun, back to the hills of happy dreams. Oh, take me back to the western plains, the prairie plains where cattle roam, where sweethearts stroll along the lanes that never lead away from home." 3 days later, he departed to the US accompanied by his wife. He says, "I was very sad to leave, but," he continues, "I am happy to return." I'm finishing. In conclusion, I would say we are confronted here with a truly notable case of an immigrant in the sparsely populated expanse of the American West, who even during the time he spent shepherding sheep, managed to never lose his former interest in study and writing, a rebel spirit, preferring always to think for himself, fighting for and defending his ideals. I believe he merits a deeper investigation about his life and works, a doctoral thesis, for example. In the meantime, his autobiography deserves to be published. In fact, his unpublished work, novels, stories, and poems, should be in print both in English and translated in Portuguese. Thanks to the clues brought to light by Donald Warren, increased now by the discovery of the estate at Boise State University, we now have enough material available for a wide-spanning work. I'd hope a volunteer presents himself, a volunteer presents himself or herself, as unfortunately for me, I no longer have life enough left to digress any further than I already have over the half a century I've spent exploring this immense and fascinating Luso-American universe. The librarian was kind enough to send me the whole archives of his work. So I have them. Anybody interested, I'll gladly share. Thank you.
See, I was right when I said he was a very generous scholar. We have some time, nous avons un peu de temps, temos algum tempo para discutir. Se tiverem perguntas, any questions, des questions, maybe I can take advantage of my position. I was curious, Onésimo, about...
Natália?
No, about the languages, because the first text you said it was translated by your son, so it was written in Portuguese, but he also wrote in English? Or
He wrote everything in English, always in English, yeah.
Oh,
Some poems are in Portuguese, but most of it is all in English.
Oh, okay.
That's the interesting part of it. So his novel is in English, his autobiography is in English, and all his letters to the editor were all in English, yes.
Okay.
I only translated that 3 pages of
Okay. So the poem you read was also written
in English, yes,
Okay.
in English, yes. The only that is short autobiography, 3 pages in Portuguese,
okay.
the rest is all in English, yes.
Okay.
The last year.
Curious.
But I can resist. Felipe Martins has a story that I told Felipe Martins about Natália. I told her this story because Natália told me that Natália, at one point, there was remember the Guerra das Bandeiras in the 80s, and Ian used to consult the intellectuals, and he was hesitant what to do, and Natália had heard he was thinking of someone who suggested that he should send the troops to the Azores to calm things down, and then President Yanis was consulting all the infractions at that time. Infractions were important. So when her time came, because she was friendly. They were very good friends before he was president. Natália told me that one day at the cocktail party, she was always with him smoking, and then she addressed him as Mr. President, Sr. President, and Magdalena told her, Natália, don't call him President, call him António like we always did. And she said, não, Sr. Presidente é muito mais erótico. But I had a microphone. Okay. But then she told me that she went to. I went to President Yanis and I told him, o Sr. Presidente manda as tropas para os Açores e leva com a independência pelos fornos. Okay, so but you were going to ask.
It jives with what she writes.
Yeah.
I mean, her first trip to the Azores is in 75. And
It jives with what she says because she spends, if memory doesn't fail me, she spends much of her, thinking about what's going on in the Azores, basically stating that continentals really do not understand what's going on here. And the armed forces movement is always on the brink of just really giving the last reason, the final reason for the Azorians to finally break free and independence. So, but she's deeply concerned about that because as Azorian as she feels, she also feels Portuguese and she wants to stay within Portugal. That seems pretty clear that, she didn't favor it.
These two anecdotes are not the Portuguese. She was the one who told me that. Sorry.
Era só detalhe sobre a autobiografia. Que está as 3 páginas que foram traduzidas do português para inglês, que é a única parte da autobiografia que ele escreveu em português e que até pede desculpa pelo português dele já não ser bom, etc. e tal. Mas isso até parece ser parte de uma carta que ele escreve, não é? Porque acaba pedindo que seja entregue dinheiro a pessoas X, Y, Z.
It's attached to he wrote this autobiography in Portuguese, but then he adds a letter. This is not a letter. It's called Coisas Incríveis Mas Verdades. Okay. See how the Portuguese sounds. Meu avô, Francisco José de Freitas, era professor da nossa freguesia da Lomba das Flores, então, spelling mistakes, Açores, por quem fui ensinado até à idade de 12 anos. Depois fui instruído por uma tia que tinha 4 anos de colégio, college, também professora, mas como se casou logo depois de chegar às Flores, nunca deu escola. Mas ele sabe, e põe entre aspas, dar escola mas como vivia pertinho da minha casa, estudei com ela por 4 anos e aprendi com ela o suficiente para entrar em qualquer universidade em Lisboa. Além disso, tinha 4 tios em negócio em Lisboa, nesse tempo, e a minha gente arranjaram com um deles para eu estar em sua casa durante os 4 anos de colégio. So that's
Mas porquê que depois tem uma parte de uma carta anexada?
No, it's this folder has a bunch of pages in Portuguese, and the letter is part of it. No.
Aleatório. Há uma incongruência. Com 4 anos de escolaridade nas Flores, não podia nunca entrar para uma universidade. Eu acho que é colégio, no sentido não de college, mas colégio, uma escola qualquer.
Sim, mas
só que depois ele usa a palavra universidade.
18 anos não se sabe bem. Com 18 anos eu podia achar que estava preparado para ir.
Mas não tinha, ele veio para a América.
Não, é que desculpa, mas é que se fizesse o suficiente para fazer exames naquela altura do 5º ano ou do 6º ano, nessa altura, não sei quantos eram, em 1900 não, é final do século portanto, ele podia fazer exames e entrar na universidade. Portanto, porque o colégio seria o liceu, a escola secundária. Não, e nessa altura ele está a pensar em college em termos americanos.
Voltar a Natália Correia. Thank you, Daniela, for your presentation. You said well, I wrote it down, but you said something about she's being like critical of everyone. I was wondering, and this is probably a very large question, and we can continue our discussion later. But Yanes, Soares, and Sá Carneiro, were those three individuals also, the object of her criticism, or she was more like in the context of the revolution, clearly refusing both the right-wing dictatorship before April and then the, whatever we want to call it, the attempted, as she wrote, the new form of dictatorship that allegedly was going to be implemented in Portugal. So those three figures represented the center during that period. Was she more inclined to that part of the political spectrum?
So, as she stated herself, like she would not place herself in the political spectrum, and she didn't think she had to, in that sense. So that's something that was imposed on her from the outside, but that she didn't impose on herself, having to define herself according to right, left, center left, center right, and whatnot. About those individuals, I mean, there are gradations of her attacks, okay? And it's very clear, I mean, at least here, it seemed clear that she had more respect for those individuals as individuals, more trust in them, not in their non-totalitarian desires, let's put it like that, or their pro-democracy desires, than she did in anybody else. So those who she considered new forms or new versions of totalitarianism with just, a wolf with different sheep's clothing, she really attacked without pity, So Othello, for instance, I mean, I invite you to just go in for the passages on Othello. Spinola is an interesting one. Like her opinion on Spinola seems to evolve throughout this 2 years, but not necessarily in a very positive light. She seems to almost pity the man as things, are progressing in 1974 into his, removal from the government. But Soares, that's what I'd say. So she's a lot kinder in her criticisms to Soares and to Sá Carneiro. I don't remember specific passages on the ends out of the top of my head, but I think that comes primarily from that understanding that they might disagree about the details, but that she trusted that they were, regardless of how imperfect their political vision might be, that it was a vision that would accommodate her freedom, right? And the freedom of others. And I think that's what she prized above all in this particular context. At least that's how I read it.
Can't resist adding one more story. 1989, Presidência Aberta. Soares came with an entourage of intellectuals, of politicians. There were 80 diplomatic figures in São Miguel. First year, the Camões Prize was awarded to Miguel Torga. The jury members came. Jorge Amado was a member of the jury. So, these people are in São Miguel. And so Natália cannot be the prima donna. You didn't mention that. I wrote about Natália Nietzsche. Nietzsche is a very strong influence in Natália's mind. Anyway. So Natália was upset that she was not being the prima donna in the Azores because she owned the Azores as far as she was the representative of the Azores, and Mário Soares was coming from Corvo to São Miguel, stopped in various islands. He stopped in Terceira, and he was going. There was a military parade, and he was told that Natália was very upset with him, and was going to give to talk to television. So Mário Soares interrupted everything, and went to her because she was not in the private plane of Marisoane. Plane was small, SATA, So Natália, Marisoane goes to her, puts his arm around her neck and says, Natália sabe que está sempre no meu coração. E Natália said, mas não estou no seu avião. So Marisoane felt bad, he arranged this, she was going to go to his plane. So she went right to the front and sat there. Plane is full. A general comes in and says, desculpe, este lugar é meu. And she said, era. And the general, and he said, and he said, the general said, alguém há de sair, E ela disse, saia você que é tropa. These are true stories. I mean, this is all reported by at the high echelon. That's how she was. Anyway.
Jives.
Yeah. About Leonor, I would like to say that when Pedro Almeida Maia knew you were going to talk about him, he was so flattered. He wrote to me, he says, Onésimo, someone is going to write about my novel. And I said, yeah, I know Leonor. And I said, how do I do? What do I do? Should I thank her? I says, you don't know if she's going to speak badly about it. So I'll tell him that. Yeah, he's a wonderful man, really. Besides being a great writer, he's a great.
I had a question for Leonor. Pedro Almeida Maia was here in the beginning of August, and he knew about your conference. And I would like to, even because you are next to Onésimo, I would like to ask you about Pedro Almeida Maia and other authors that are coming up in the Azores, in the islands. Again, the question of the Azorean literature, but more than this, are island literatures a kind of a literature that brings new perspectives to the whole Portuguese, European world's literature? And how are you seeing this new authors coming?
He doesn't want us to have lunch.
Posso responder em francês ou em português? O que preferem? Em português? Pode ser em português? Bom, é uma pergunta difícil, não é? Penso que está. A descoberta da obra do Pedro Almeida Maia resulta de várias situações. Em primeiro lugar, porque eu estava a lecionar uma unidade curricular intitulada Sociedades e Culturas Insulares, onde eu procurava demonstrar que aquela ideia de ilha ligada apenas à ideia de escassez, muito trabalhada pela ciência das ilhas, escassez de oportunidades, escassez no âmbito da educação, um lugar muito periférico, com pouca coisa para oferecer, a não ser o facto de ser um espaço normalmente ligado ao paraíso, um pouco mais. Este livro em particular permitiu ver com os estudantes que, na verdade, os Açores são muito mais do que paisagem também, apesar de ser paisagem, e permitiam demonstrar que as ilhas podem ser também centralidade e podem ser deste lado periférico. Portanto, eu comecei a descobrir, eu própria, comecei a descobrir também, ainda muito recentemente, tem uns anos, 2, 3 anos, a produção do Pedro Almeida Maia. E depois estava a trabalhar no âmbito de um projeto ligado à literatura e ecologia, porque tinha trabalhado alguns outros autores não insulares, o João Reis com Cadernos de Água, que é um livro também muito interessante sobre aquilo que são as mobilidades forçadas por causa das ecologias, também um Portugal, aliás, uma península à deriva, já deixou de ser península, não é? Procurei encontrar outros autores, nomeadamente autores ligados à ilha, onde essa problemática ecológica tivesse visibilidade. E foi aí que eu comecei por capítulo 41, antes de ir ao mau tempo no canal, e depois então vou à procura de outras obras dele e vejo que o Tempo Canal também está relacionada com esta preocupação ecológica, com esta preocupação ambiental, que é no fundo uma preocupação atual, é um debate contemporâneo extremamente relevante. Portanto, no âmbito da descoberta da produção dele foi nesse sentido, não é? De que forma os Açores e as ilhas também nos permitem equacionar e problematizar temas que são temas contemporâneos e completamente atuais. Por outro lado, também eu estou muito ligada àquilo que é a ideia de viagem, utopia e utopismo como pensamento crítico e como denúncia, não é? Portanto, de algo que não está a funcionar muito bem, e também procuro trabalhar a obra do Joel Neto, porque tem também um particular apreço, nomeadamente no colóquio que organizaste na Universidade dos Açores, há uns 2 anos, creio eu, em que também estudei a Jennifer, a Princesa da França, onde aí é um relato também muito certeiro, ainda que problemático. Eu não quero levantar celeumas, acho que já chega, não é? Portanto, um texto também muito problemático sobre aquilo que são os bairros periféricos também da visibilidade, não é? Política, e, portanto, com questões também relacionadas com ideologias, crítica aos governantes e assim sucessivamente, e com todas as questões que isso levanta. Portanto, sim, tenho tentado, sobretudo, destacar autores mais jovens, ainda com uma produção interessantíssima, ambos, e já perfeitamente legitimada, consolidada, são vozes incontornáveis da literatura contemporânea, e, sobretudo, que estejam relacionados com questões de condição insular, insularidades e questões mais de agora, abismos sociais, movimentações e mobilidades, novas mobilidades que podem resultar justamente destes assuntos. Portanto, é nesse âmbito que eu descobri e que estou a trabalhar justamente com os meus alunos. Uma aluna minha está agora a iniciar o mestrado com cadernos de campo do Joel Neto, portanto também estou muito entusiasmada com o resultado que virá desse estudo. Portanto, na Madeira, a dar literatura açoriana, faz parte.
Acho que temos mais uma questão e depois se calhar vamos para o nosso assunto.
Muito obrigado. Não sei se isto está. My question is for Daniela. Nice to meeting you once again. About Natália Correia. I was wondering during your presentation, when she left the PPD, the nowadays Social Democratic Party, at least in its name, what do you think about the fact that after the death of Sá Carneiro, and we all know that she had a more effective relationship with him because she presented him to Snoep Cassis. She left PPD because of the kind of the policies that the party was putting in practice. For example, the idea that she has related to the European Union, that she was against it, the way that the governments of Cavaco Silva treated the culture, the cultural sector, even the movement she led in favor of culture, that was more or less with the not official, but with the support. Yes, thank you. The support of Mário Soares. So she started with the Socialist Party and she ended with some kind of Mário Soares. So she turned around. That's some kind of food for thought, maybe. Thank you.
I mean, you already mentioned a lot of the reasons why, she became an uncomfortable person to have within the party. And she knew that. I mean, my understanding, I didn't do as deep a dive into that part of her, personal relationship with the party for this. But I mean, he forgot to mention the question of abortion, right? And this was a crucial division. This was a crucial division between her and not just the right, even the center left at the time. You know, it didn't have the Socialist Party exactly arguing for the right of abortion. And I mean, some of her most iconic moments, you know, that everyone remembers her for are around her intervention, you know, the truca, you know, poem against, what was his name, Morgado? Yes, good job. You know, so I think this is, again, I don't think that this is evidence of her being a turncoat or, I mean, I think she's uncomfortable on purpose, that she's disruptive on purpose, that she sees this as part of her role as an intellectual, as an activist, and that this fits, I would say, within this, you know, anarchist libertarian, you know, philosophy that seems to really be this strong undercurrent that drives her political activism. And at the end of the day, that's kind of my main argument, that she is not flip-flopping. In fact, she's, if anything, she's being extremely coherent to these principles about individual freedom, right? About the role of the intellectual, about activism and intellectualism and how they should be in society. And she's willing to stay in the parties for as long as the parties present a vehicle that allows her to turn that activism into action, right? Now, when she is promoting, you know, the right to abortion in 1982, right? I mean, she sounds like she's siding with the women's liberation movement and with the feminist activists of the 70s that she abhorred. I mean, she didn't abhor them as people. She abhorred some of the ideas that they were promoting in the 1970s. She found them dogmatic, and I mean, she had many strong words to say to the feminisms of the revolution as well. So I guess that's in many ways, that's the lens that I ended up bringing, that I didn't see flip-flopping, I didn't see incoherence. If anything, I saw a strong adherence to this set of principles, right? And those were deeply well-informed. I mean, this is a very well-read woman. It's incredible just how well-read she is in political theory. I mean, she's quoting Lenin, and then she's quoting, you know, Proudhon, and then she's going to get Kropotkin. You know, she's bringing all of them, and she's coming up with her own vision of what her individual anarchism, if you want to call it that, is, right? That's there.
Okay, great discussion, everyone. Lunch now, and at 2 o'clock, we're here full of energy.